Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chen, and welcome to my YouTube channel. To kickstart my channel, I have decided to read the beautiful 5-volume Danmei series, Thousand Autumns, also known as Tian Qiu, by Meng starting with Volume 1. We are going to start with chapters 1, 2, and 3. Enjoy! Chapter 1, After the Duel. Banbu Peak, Half-Step Peak. As the name implied, the summit boasted only a few square inches on which to stand. A half step forward led to a majestic cliff, thousands of meters tall. Above, jagged stones jutted skyward and bowed trees crept forth. Below, great swaths of mist swirled and haunting wails echoed throughout. It was a treacherous, craggy place where heaven and earth did not meet. Facing this cliff loomed another mountain summit called Yinghui Peak. It was no less high nor steep than Banbu. Its walls also soared for thousands of meters, sheer as if pared by a knife. There seemed to be no foothold, and even its scant greenery was ungrounded in soil, its roots twining about the rocks. The sight was enough to make anyone shudder and regret their attempts to scale this peak. And so, the name Yinghui Peak was born. Certain Regret Peak. Between these two peaks yawned a natural chasm. Seen from above, a sea of clouds drifted lazily, concealing the fathoms of its depths, and one could faintly hear the vicious roar of unceasing rapids. The calming woodcutters and hunters dared not climb there. Even Xiantian experts who stood there would find that a sigh stirred within their hearts, lamenting the insignificance of humans before nature. However, below the mist at the foot of the cliff, between the river waters and mountain walls, wound a stone path paved with uneven rubble. It was long, narrow, and rugged, yet at this moment 2 men walked upon it, one in front and the other behind. As the river raged and galloped, waves churned up from time to time and broke against the wet, slippery rocks. If one lacked just a little prudence while walking, they'd be soaked through by the spray even without falling into the waters. But if they tried to lean away instead, they'd meet that sheer rock face and its sharp, jutting stones. In short, the path was a dilemma liable to leave anyone in a woeful state. And yet, these 2 men seemed to stroll leisurely along as though through a courtyard, their movements confident and graceful. I heard that 20 years ago, Xuandu Mountain's perfected Master Qi defeated the Gokturk's #1 martial artist, Hulugu, right here on Banbu Peak. And then he forced him to swear an oath to stay out of the Central Plains for the next 20 years. A pity this disciple was still too young to watch that duel. The battle must have been incomparably splendid. The young man who spoke walked behind the other. Their pace was neither slow nor quick, yet he always kept 3 steps behind. The man in front sauntered in small steps, his demeanor as languid as if he truly trod on level ground. The steps of the young man behind him stretched a little longer. Taken alone, the young man in back also bore an immortal's weightless grace, but seen together, it was easy to find the subtle differences between the two. Yan Wushi gave a derisive laugh. Qi Fengge was indeed worthy of being called #1 in all the world. Hulugu was a foreign barbarian. He overestimated himself and invited humiliation because of it. He only had himself to blame, yet for the sake of upholding a Taoist sect's pure and lofty image, Qi Fengge refused to kill him and chose instead to establish a 20-year covenant. Apart from sowing the seeds of trouble for Xuandu Mountain's future, what benefits did he receive? Yu Shengyan was curious. Shitsuan, was Hulugu truly that great of a martial artist? If I were to fight him now, I would have no guarantee of victory. He's really that strong? Yu Shengyan was aghast. Of course, he understood just how profound his own master's martial arts were. Hulugu's abilities must be just as terrifying if Yan Wushi gave him such an appraisal. Perhaps he'd even rank among the top 3 in the world. Yan Wushi's tone was indifferent. Why else would I say that Qi Fengge left endless troubles for his own disciples and future generations? 20 years ago, Hulagu might have been slightly inferior to Qi Fengge, but in 20 years, such a gap can be closed. And now, Qi Fengge is dead. Xuandu Mountain will never find a second Qi Fengge. Yu Shengyuan released a soft breath. Yes, perfected Master Qi passed away 5 years ago. Who is the current sect leader of Xuandu Mountain? A disciple of Qi Fengge's named Shen Qiao. Yan Wushi had little reaction to the name. He'd met Qi Fengge only once, and that was 25 years ago. Back then, Shen Qiao had only just been accepted as one of Qi Fengge's personal disciples. There was no doubt that Xuandu Mountain was called the world's #1 Taoist sect. But in the opinion of Yan Wushi, who had just emerged from 10 years of seclusion, no one on Xuandu was worthy of standing as his opponent, other than Qi Fengge. Unfortunately, Qi Fengge was dead. Yu Shengyuan saw his master's lack of interest and added, I heard that Hulagu's disciple Kun Yue, the current #1 martial artist of the Guturk and wise king of the left, is here today at the summit of Banbu to challenge Shen Qiao. He says that he wants to clear the shame from Hulagu's loss. Does Shitsun wish to go and watch? Yan Wushi answered neither yes nor no. In the 10 years or so I spent in seclusion, what other major events occurred, apart from Qi Fengge's death? He asked instead. Yu Shengyan thought for a moment. Shortly after you entered seclusion, the new emperor of Qi, Galwei, ascended to the throne. But he is a man of lustful indulgence and boundless extravagance, so Qi's strength has plummeted since then. There are rumors that Yuan Yong, the emperor of Zhou, is plotting to attack Qi. Zhou will probably annex the north soon. Over these last 10 years, because of Qi Fengge's death, the rankings of the world's top 10 martial artists has also changed. Yi Pichun of Chunyang Monastery on Qincheng Mountain, Buddhist master Xueting of Zhou, and Ruyan Kehui of Linchuan Academy are recognized as the top 3 in the world, and they represent exactly the 3 schools of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. But some also say that Kosa sage of the Tuyuhun should be ranked among the top 3. There's also Hulagu. If he's grown stronger over all the years, it's possible he could compete for the #1 position the next time he enters the Central Plains. After this speech, Yu Shengyan saw that his master was continuing along their path and couldn't help but add, Shitsun, today's duel between Kunye and Shen Qiao will surely be another rare and exciting battle. Shen Qiao is a recluse, and he's fought even less since he took over leadership of Xuandu's Violet Palace. He only ranks in the top 10 on accounts of his master, Qi Fengge's prestigious reputation. If Shitsun wishes to see the true extent of Xuandu Mountain's strength, today's battle is not to be missed. I imagine the summit of Yinghui Peak is already packed full with martial experts who've come to watch. Did you think that I came here today to watch the battle? Yan Wushi finally paused his steps. Yu Shengyan was a bit flustered. Then what does Shitsun mean to do? He'd entered discipleship beneath Yan Wushi at only 7 years old. Then, 3 years later, Yan Wushi had lost the battle to the Grand Master of the demonic sects, Cui Youwang. Injured, Yan Wushi entered seclusion, a seclusion that lasted a decade. During that time, Yu Shengyan continued his training according to Yan Wushi's instructions and also traveled to many places. His progress put him far beyond where he'd been before. He'd entered the ranks of first-class martial artists within the Jianghu long ago. But, inevitably, because he hadn't seen his master in 10 years, there was a sense of estrangement and unfamiliarity between them. Moreover, Yan Wushi's martial expertise had only grown more profound while he was away. and so the awe within Yu Shengyan's heart had grown deeper along with it. So much so that the usual bold and untrammeled behavior that others saw from him became restrained and tentative in his Shitsuan's company. Yan Wushi clasped his hands behind his back. "I've already seen the battle between Qifengge and Hulugu," he said, tone indifferent. "Shen Qiao and Kun Ye are their disciples, and they are still young. No matter how strong they are, they can't surpass the grand spectacle of that year's Qihu match. I brought you here because of the fast-flowing waters and the treacherous terrain, which connects to the energies of the sky and the spirits of the earth. This makes it most suitable for training and enlightenment. While I was in seclusion, I had no time to look after you. But now that I've left, I cannot leave you to loiter and stagnate at your current level of progress. Before you comprehend the 5th stage of the Fengling scriptures, you shall stay here." Yu Shengyan suddenly felt a bit wounded. Though he had spent these past 10 years traveling here and there, he hadn't dared to neglect his training, not even for a day. Now he was only in his early 20s, but had already attained the Fengling scriptures 4th stage. In the Jianghu, he was considered one of the few martial experts of the younger generation, so he'd been quite satisfied. But now it seemed his Shitsuan saw no merit in any of this. As if sensing his disciple's emotions, the corner of Yan Wushi's mouth tugged up in a mocking smile. "When I was your age, I had already broken through the 6th stage. What do you have to be proud of? Instead of comparing yourself to those small fry, why not compare yourself to me?" Although the hair at Yan Wushi's temples was peppered with white, it didn't detract from its charm. In fact, that shadow of a smile made it even harder for anyone to avert their eyes from his handsome face. His white robe, long and loose, flapped and rustled in the blustering wind, but he remained as stalwart and unmoving as ever. He simply stood there with his hands behind his back, but radiating from him was an invisible aura of an all-encompassing disdain, both intimidating and crushing. As Yu Shengyan stood opposite him, a suffocating pressure engulfed him from the front, forcing him 2 steps back. "Shitsuan is a heavenly talent. How can this disciple dare to compare himself with you?" he said, reverent and fearful. "Greet me with the most powerful attack you can think of. I want to see how far you've progressed over the years." Yu Shengyan had not been tested in martial arts since he'd left seclusion. The order left him a little hesitant, although somewhat eager as well. But when he saw the flash of impatience on Yan Wushi's face, his single trace of hesitation vanished. "Then, please forgive this disciple's rudeness." As the words fell from his lips, his body moved as he wielded and his sleeves rose. Moving too swiftly to be seen, he was already in front of Yan Wushi. Yu Shengyan raised an arm, his palm striking forth. To a bystander, it would appear there was no force behind this movement. It looked as gentle as if he were plucking a flower on a spring day, or whisking away dusk on an autumn night, airy and light, without a wisp of firepower. Only those in the thick of things would feel that palm's might. In a meter-wide radius around him, the grass and trees bowed, the river's waters reversed, waves swelled, and foam leapt as massive air currents erupted, and all this power surged towards Yan Wushi. These were currents capable of suspending rivers and overturning seas, yet when he reached Yan Wushi, they seemed to be blocked by an invisible barrier. The hurtling currents split into 2 and veered off to either side. He still stood in the same spot as before, completely unmoved. Only when Yu Shengyan's palm was right before his eyes did he indifferently extend a single finger. Only 1 finger, and no more. And with just this finger, Yu Shengyan's attack was frozen in mid-air. Yu Shengyan felt the winds from his palm strike suddenly reverse and roar towards him in a countercurrent many times more powerful than his own. Alarmed, he used the current's momentum and hastily retreated. With this one retreat, he reeled back 10 steps. Only after he'd found his footing upon a rock did he finally speak, still a bit shocked and shaky. "This disciple thanks Shitsun for his mercy." Yu Shengyan had been quite confident when he used his palm strike. Few people in all of the Jianghu could withstand it. And yet, with just one finger, Yan Wushi forced him to withdraw his palm to protect himself. Fortunately, his Shitsun was merely testing his progress and hadn't pressed his advantage. If it had been an enemy... Yu Shengyan broke out in a cold sweat at the thought. He couldn't help it. He didn't dare to be so self-assured any more. Yan Wushi had achieved his goal. Now that he'd given Yu Shengyan a wake-up call, he didn't bother saying much more. "Don't waste your superb talents. In a few days, I will travel to the Goktur Khaganate. Once you've mastered the 5th stage here, if you have nothing to do, go and find your Shixiong. Don't wonder about traveling too much." "Yes," Yu Shengyan said reverently. "The scenery is sculpted by nature and is seldom visited," said Yan Wushi. "I wish to take a tour around, so you need not..." Before he could finish, a series of noises came from a short distance overhead. The two of them followed the sounds and looked up to see a man plummeting down as if he'd fallen from high above. He hurtled through layers after layer of branches before finally crashing to a stop at the bottom of the cliff. Even Yu Shengyan had to gasp at the muffled thump of his landing. Surely, even a Xiantian expert would be hard-pressed to survive a fall from a mountain peak that high. What was more, this man certainly wouldn't have fallen off the cliff for no reason. He must have been seriously injured, even before the fall. "Shitsun?" Yu Shengyan looked to Yan Wushi for instructions. "Go over and take a look," he said. The man's Taoist robe was slashed through in many places, probably because it tore against the branches and rock face during his fall. His flesh was as mosaic of overlapping bloodstains and fresh wounds, making it hard to even discern his appearance. He had lost consciousness already, unable to keep hold of the sword in his hand. When he'd hit the ground, the sword followed suit and had landed nearby. "The bones all over his body have probably been shattered." Yu Shengyan frowned and inspected him for a while, clicking his tongue in sympathy. Then he went to check his pulse. There, he felt what seemed like a glimmer of life. But even if you could save a man in this state, he would probably be better off dead. Yu Shengyan was from a demonic sect after all. He might have been young, but his kindness was limited. So, even though he had a pill of great revival on hand, he had no intention of giving it to this injured man. It was just, "Shitsun, today is the date of the duel between Shen Qiao and Kunye. This man fell down from above, where the duel is being held. Could he be..." Yan Wushi walked over. Instead of looking at the man, he picked up the sword. The blade was as cold as autumn water and wholly undamaged. As it reflected the river and the mists, subtle ripples seemed to dance across its surface. Near the hilt were 4 small characters carved there in seal script. Yu Shengyan came over to take a look. "Ah! The Shanhe Tongbei sword! It's the sword of the Xuandu Violet Palace's sect leader. This man really is Shen Qiao." He looked back in disbelief at the grievously injured man so close to death. Shen Qiao. Qi Fengge's ability were the best in the world. Shen Qiao was his personal disciple and he rose to lead Xuandu Mountain. How could he lose so completely? Yu Shengyan squatted in front of Shen Qiao and frowned. Could Kunye's martial arts have grown to surpass even his master Hulu Gu's? If any other person from Xuandu Mountain had fallen, Yan Wushi wouldn't even give them a second glance. But Shen Qiao, the sect leader, was a special case. He tossed the sword Shan He Tongbei to Yu Shengyan, then looked at Shen Qiao's unrecognizable countenance for another moment. Finally, an enigmatic smile crept across Yan Wusher's face. First, take out the pill of great revival and give it to him. Chapter 2. Blind Man. Of course, Yan Wucher would never deign to carry some grievously injured dying man on his own back, even if that person was the sect leader of Xuandu Mountain. Bearing such burdens was what disciples were for. Therefore, the task fell to Yu Shengyan. Huan Yue's sect had a spare villa in Funing County, which was near Banbu Peak. Since nearly every bone in Shen Qiao's body was shattered, it was no simple affair for Yu Shengyan to carry him on his back. He also had to be extra conscious of his strength to avoid further aggravating Shen Qiao's injuries. Even though Yu Shengyan's footwork and Qinggong were first-rate, it still took him almost an hour to arrive at the villa. Yan Wusher had gone on ahead of him. At this point, he was already languidly sipping tea. Shutsun, do you really want to save Shen Qiao? After making arrangements for the man, Yu Shengyan came over to report. You don't think I should? 9/10 of his tendons and meridians have snapped, and his bones are shattered in multiple places. A small portion of his internal breathing may remain, but even if we can save him, it'll be hard for him to recover his martial arts. Not to mention that he cracked open the back of his head when he landed, so he might even wake up an idiot. Yan Wusher gave a small, cold smile. Chifunga's disciple, the head of Xuandu Mountain. He stood at the summit of the Taoist disciple, commanding the land in boundless glory. Yet with one defeat, he's been rendered less than an invalid. Even if he returns to Xuandu Mountain, he can no longer be sect leader. Once he awakens and understands the situation, I wonder how he will feel. Yu Shengyan sighed. That's true. Even ordinary people wouldn't be able to accept such a nosedive, let alone someone beloved by the heavens like Shen Qiao. The higher you stand, the harder you fall. Then he became doubtful. But then again, Shen Qiao is Chifunga's disciple, and he was capable enough to ascend the ranks at Xuandu Mountain and stand among the world's top 10. So his skills must have been extraordinary. Even if Kun Ye did defeat him, how could it have been a defeat this crushing? Could Kun Ye's martial prowess be even greater than Hulugu's was 20 years ago? Yan Wusher smiled once more. When Shen Qiao wakes up, if he hasn't turned into an idiot, you can ask him. Yu Shengyan had noticed that his Shitsun's mood seemed to have improved and his smiles grown more frequent since they'd picked up Shen Qiao. But he was under no illusion that Shitsun was fond of Shen Qiao. After all, Yan Wusher had barely even given Shen Qiao a second look when they first found him. By saving Shen Qiao, does Shitsun wish to put Xuandu Mountain in our debt? Yu Shengyan asked tentatively. Yan Wusher was in high spirits. If he had died in defeat, all his troubles would have died with him. But now, when he wakes up and realizes that he is not only alive, but that he's also lost everything he once had, grievously injured, his strength destroyed, and martial arts no more, how will he feel then? The greater one's prestige and authority, the less they can withstand such a blow. His heart and mind will certainly break, and when they do, I will take him under my wing. I'll gradually train the once sanctimonious and tender-hearted sect leader of Xuandu Mountain into a disciple of the demonic discipline. In the eyes of the world, he will become someone completely immoral. Wouldn't that be terribly interesting? His words left Yu Shengyan dumbfounded. What if he does wake up an idiot? Then bury him alive. Anywhere will do. Yan Wusher replied flippant. Yu Shengyan had always known that Shitsun was capricious, and the kind of man who did as he pleased. but he'd had little chance these past years to experience firsthand what he'd solely heard from the mouths of others. Only now, witnessing it, did he realize how true such assessments had been. Practitioners of the demonic discipline were fickle in their conduct, driven purely by self interest. In the end, Yu Shengyan was a disciple of the Huanyue sect, one of the three demonic sects. He would never have been merciful enough to save Shun Xiao if there was nothing in it for him. Shutsun, Sun Xiao is of very special status. So why aren't we exchanging him for a favor from Xuandu Mountain? Surely they can't leave their own sect leader to wander around as a vagrant, even if only for the sake of their sect's reputation. Yan Wushi sneered faintly. If his eldest disciple, Bian Yan Mei, were standing here, he would never have asked such a childish and ridiculous question. Yu Shengyan was still a little too green. But he was in a good mood today and didn't begrudge an answer. Shun Qiao ranks within the world's top 10 martial artists, as you know. Even though he was a recluse, and few have seen him fight, still he was someone who could take up Qi Fengge's mantle. So, how unskilled could he be? After all, Kunye is no hulugu, who's joined the ranks of Xiantian experts. Shun Qiao should have walked away from this duel unscathed, even if he did lose to Kunye. So why did he suffer such a terrible defeat? It turned out that Yu Shengyan wasn't a complete fool. Hearing this, he said, "Something unexpected must have happened during the duel, and if that something was Xuandu Mountain's fault, then if we hand Shun Xiao over to them, they might not thank us for it, in which case, not only would we not earn any favor, we might even bring down trouble on our own heads." So he wasn't entirely beyond help. Yan Wushi looked askance at him. With me here, Huanyue's sect need not concern ourselves with the opinions of others, let alone exchange for any favors. Shen Qiao might have been of extraordinary status, but to Yan Wushi, he was no more than a novel plaything. It was an incredibly imperious thing to say, but Yan Wushi could pull it off. 10 years ago, he'd battled Cui Youwang, and although he'd suffered injuries and defeat, Cui Youwang hadn't escaped unscathed either. Back then, Cui Youwang's power was already unfathomable, even on par with Qi Fengge's. 10 years later, Cui Youwang and Qi Fengge were dead, and Yan Wushi had broken through the Fenglin scriptures' 9th stage and risen to even greater heights. It was impossible to know how far he'd progressed just yet, but he surely wasn't below where he'd been 10 years ago. Scant few people had yet learned of his reappearance in the Jianghu. Otherwise, things would have been much livelier. The world's top 10 rankings would definitely need an update too. When he thought of that, Yu Shengyan's eyes grew hot with excitement. While Shutsun was in seclusion, He Huan sect came around looking for trouble twice every 3 days, he said. This disciple fought with Sang Jingxing once and was injured, so he had to leave Fenglin province and travel far into the Jianghu. That's why he traveled about for so many years. But fortunately, your esteemed self has returned. What outsiders called demonic sects, or the demonic discipline, was, in truth, a blanket term. Initially, the demonic discipline referred to the practitioners of Ruyue Mountain's Ruyue sect in Fenglin province, but later, Ruyue sect splintered into 3 branches: Huanyue sect, He Huan sect, and Fajing sect. Although the 3 branches were all part of the demonic discipline, they were at odds with each other. Their clashes were extensive and endless, both overt and covert. After Yan Wushi entered seclusion 10 years ago, He Huan sect had eyed up the leaderless Huanyue sect and aspired to absorb it. However, the disciples of Huanyue sect were already scattered and the sect itself was uncentralized. Furthermore, Bien Yen Mei was cautious and low-key with his actions. He couldn't defeat the likes of Yuan Xiuxiu or Sang Jingxing, but he covertly stirred up a fair bit of trouble for a He Huan sect. Thus, their efforts canceled each other out. So He Huan sect hadn't gained much for their trouble. Instead, it was Yu Shengyan who'd gotten the short end of the stick several times, owing to his youth and late entry into the sect. Now that Yan Wushi was out of seclusion, the members of Huan Yue's sect were like lost children who'd found their mother. Naturally, Yu Shengyan was overcome with joy. Ordinary servants won't be able to tend to Shen Qiao's injuries, so stay here and look after him for a few days until he wakes, said Yan Wushi. Then return to Banbu Peak, and make sure to master the Fenglan Scripture's 5th stage. Yu Shengyan respectfully responded, "This disciple obeys." Shen Qiao was badly injured, but the wounds on his face were mostly scratches from where he'd fallen. Once the blood was cleaned off, his original appearance was revealed. Neither the abrasions on his face nor the circle of gauze around his head could detract from his handsome beauty. From the curve of his nose to his tightly closed lips, all his features carried an air of aloof restraint. He looked very much like what anyone would expect from one of Xuandu Mountain's Taoist practitioners, someone far removed from the common people. It wasn't hard to imagine how much brighter his splendor might shine once his eyes finally opened. Of course, Yu Shengyan wasn't exactly ugly himself. He was one of Yan Wushi's disciples, after all, and Yan Wushi didn't take on ugly disciples. He'd seen many peerless beauties during his travels, but he still spent a long moment staring at Shen Qiao's bruised and battered face in a daze. Only afterwards did he pick up the ointment and begin applying it to him, all while sighing on the inside. Broken bones could be set and meridians could be rejoined, but badly injured internal organs were not so simple to repair. Even worse, his cultivation had been greatly degraded. From now on, he might be even weaker than a common man. When Yu Shengyan tried to imagine losing all his hard-earned martial arts in a single night, his mind rebelled at the idea. And in Shen Qiao's situation, the shock would be even greater. Such a pity, Yu Shengyan muttered to himself, looking at the pale, bloodless face and shaking his head. Yan Wushi had only stepped in to save Shen Qiao on a whim. Now that the man was saved, all responsibility had been tossed onto Yu Shengyan, and Yan Wushi didn't bother showing the slightest interest. Funing County was small and didn't normally attract many visitors, but because the battle at Banbu Peak had been so famously sensational, these days there were quite a few Jianghu travelers stopping there to rest for the night after coming from Banbu Peak. Yu Shengyan was able to gather a fair bit of news from them even with only the occasional trip outside. For example, the duel between Shen Qiao and Kunye had been extremely thrilling, but unfortunately Shen Qiao was no Qifeng Ge. It was said that he was far below his master's level, while Kunye was well on the way to surpassing the prowess Hulugu had possessed 20 years ago. Thus, Taoist Master Shen wasn't just defeated, but also thrown off the cliff, and not even his bones had survived. It was rumored that before the duel, many tempers had flared with righteous indignation at Kunye's brazen challenge to Shen Qiao. Some were eager to fight him themselves, to smash the Gokturk's arrogance. But after the battle, when they saw Xuandu Mountain utterly defeated, the people who'd wanted to stand up all scampered away, too afraid to take a swing at Kunye. With the match, Kunye's reputation had soared. He'd replaced Shen Qiao and ascended to the top 10. It was said that on this visit to the Central Plains, he would challenge their martial experts one by one and his next target was likely Buddhist master Xue Ting of Zhou. The land had not been unified since the Jin's mass migration to the south and the uprising of the five barbarians. Now Zhou and Qi were in the north, the Chun dynasty was in the south, and the Gokturks of Tuyuhun each occupied vast stretches of land along the borders, while sects and families all served their own masters. As the leader of the Taoist sects, Xuandu Mountain had been firmly neutral since Qifengge's time and did not involve themselves in worldly power struggles. Now that Shen Qiao had been defeated by Kun Ye and his fate was unknown, no one knew who'd succeed him as the leader of Xuandu Mountain, nor did they know if that successor would carry on the neutral stance of the previous generations. If they did not, the balance of the world would shift. But the protagonist at the center of this vortex remained lying in bed while those rumors swirled, with Yu Shengyan and the village servants applying his medicine and changing his clothes for him every day. Devoid of thought or consciousness, of joy or sorrow, he was completely unaware of the happenings in the outside world. It wasn't until half a month later that he made his first movement. Hastily summoned by the servants, Yu Shengyan watched as Shen Qiao slowly opened his eyes. "You've been badly injured," he said, "and your broken bones haven't mended yet, so it's best you stay still." The other man frowned a little, his lips opening and closing as if he wanted to say something. Then a blank look came over his face. Surely the fall hadn't actually turned him into an idiot. Yu Shengyan pondered while he asked, "Do you remember what your name is?" The other man gave a sluggish blink, then slowly shook his head, the movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. Amnesia? That was to be expected. After all, his head had suffered severe trauma. Yu Shengyan still remembered the day he'd carried Shen Qiao back, and how there'd been a gaping gash on the back of his head so long and deep he could nearly see the dense white skull inside. "This friend," Shen Qiao spoke with extreme effort. Yu Shengyan moved closer to listen. "There is only darkness before my eyes. Perhaps I cannot see." Yu Shengyan was shocked. Shen Qiao hadn't woken up an idiot. Instead, he'd woken up blind. Chapter 3. A Game. "Your name is Shen Qiao. You were a disciple of our Huanyue sect, and you suffered a great injury somehow. Fortunately, I happened to pass by and find you, and we managed to save you just in time. The enemies who hurt you were from He Huan sect. I was no match for them on my own, so I brought you here first. Once you've healed up and recovered your martial arts, we'll go back and take revenge on them." Yu Shengyan rattled off this nonsense with a straight face, but Shen Qiao listened to it all, solemn and intent. At the end, he asked, "Then how should I address you?" "My surname is Yu Shengyan. I am your Shixiong." These words defied all decency. Yu Shengyan was in his early 20s, while Shen Qiao's appearance didn't show his age. He was Qifengge's disciple, and he'd led Xuandu Mountain for 5 years. How could he possibly be younger than Yu Shengyan? It was an obvious ploy on Yu Shengyan's part, taking advantage of Shen Qiao's blindness to earn an undue address. But Shen Qiao followed his lead obediently. "Greetings, Shixiong." Looking into that kind and honest face, Yu Shengyan inexplicably felt the smallest twinge of guilt. He tried to brush aside the topic. "That's a good boy. Since you can't get up yet, just stay on your back and recuperate. Once you're healed, I'll bring you to pay your respects to our master." "All right," said Shen Qiao. He closed his eyes, but then reopened them a moment later. His eyes didn't focus, so they appeared vacant, his gaze spiritless. "Shixiong, is there something else?" Yu Shengyan knew he had a soft spot for beauties. When he saw Shen Qiao, the glorious sect leader who'd sat at the helm of the world's Taoist sects, fallen into such dire straits, he thought again that it was such an awful misfortune. Shen Qiao was truly pitiful. If the past him were here instead, with his sect in hand and his martial arts at its peak, how majestic would that be? I wish to drink some water. Don't drink any water for now. The medicine will be ready in a moment. For the time being, you must take medicine as your water. Just as he said this, a maid came over with the medicine. Perhaps the wild backstory he'd woven for Shen Xiao just now had aroused his rare sense of guilt, because Yu Shengyan took the bowl in hand, asked the maid to prop Shen Xiao's neck up with a pillow, and then personally fed him the medicine, spoon by spoon. Though Shen Qiao's bones weren't completely shattered, they came close. His muscles, tendons, and meridians were all gravely injured, and he'd been on the verge of losing his life. It was only on account of his strong foundations that he awakened in less than a month. He'd have to stay in bed for 3 more months if he was to have any hope of recovery. Yu Shengyan had endured much hardship beneath Yan Wushi when it came to training, but outside of training, the disciple's lifestyle was no hardship at all. Demonic sects were always extravagant, so his food, clothing, and spending rivaled that of a rich family's young master. Spoon-feeding medicine to someone was far out of his wheelhouse. No matter how careful he was, the occasional drop still splattered onto Shen Xiao's lapels, but Shen Qiao continued to drink spoonful after spoonful without any expression of dissatisfaction. Once he was finished, he even smiled in gratitude. Thank you, Shishong. Gentle and well-behaved, handsome and amiable. The curve of his smile wasn't broad, but it was enough to tint his pale face with warmth. The maid at his side flushed quietly and quickly averted her eyes. Shen Qiao didn't ask any questions, and that's what Yu Shengyan found strange. If he'd been the one to wake up without his memories, while blind, injured, and unable to get out of bed, then even if he managed to keep his spirit from breaking, he certainly couldn't have stayed this calm. Why haven't you asked me when you'll recover? With Shuxiong and Shifu around, you must be rushing about here and there, running yourselves ragged over my situation. Shen Qiao coughed several times, his movement tugging on his wound and eliciting a frown. If I asked, wouldn't I simply trouble you further? Yu Shengyan found himself tongue-tied. Perhaps it was because he'd never seen someone so considerate and thoughtful. Or perhaps because he really did feel a little guilty when he looked at that face. But he didn't know what to say. Only after a long moment did he speak again. Then you should rest properly first. I won't bother you anymore. I'll return tomorrow to give you more medicine. Thank you, Shuxiong. Please send Shutsun my regards as well. I will. Yu Shengyan didn't want to drag out the awkwardness any longer. He rubbed his nose, said these words, and left. He had some doubts about whether Shen Xiao was faking his amnesia, but he visited Shen Xiao daily, and his patient was always the same as when he'd first awakened, gentle, optimistic, and full of gratitude toward Yu Shengyan. Whatever Yu Shengyan said, Shen Xiao accepted it all without question, as honest and straightforward as a blank sheet of paper. Once he was able to get out of bed and move around a little, Shen Qiao even proposed to personally visit his Shitsuan Yan Wushi to thank him. If not for Yu Shengyan's reminder, Yan Wushi would have forgotten about Shen Qiao entirely. During his 10 years of seclusion, the world had undergone drastic changes. It was far more than he could be briefed on in just a couple of sentences. There were many sects in the world, each backing different political powers and regimes. The Gao clan of Qi was known for their erratic and outlandish behavior, and many generations of their emperors had held intimate ties with demonic sects. Ever since Gao Wei became emperor, he'd grown close to He Huan sect, and so He Huan sect's influence within Qi had surged as well. Back when Yuan Hu was in control of Zhou, he'd revered Buddhism. That's why Buddhist master Xueting had been honored as state preceptor of Zhou. However, after Yuan Yong came to power, the winds shifted. The new emperor believed in neither Taoism nor Buddhism, and even prohibited both by imperial edict. As a result, the influence of Buddhism greatly declined. As for the Chun dynasty in the south, it was led by the Confucian Lingquan Academy. Its master, Rujian Kehui, was single-minded in his service to the Emperor of Chun, and in return, the emperor relied on him heavily. Before Yan Wushi had gone into seclusion, he served as an official in Zhou under another identity, as an assistant to the then Duke of Lu, Yuan Yong. But when he was wounded in battle with Cui Youwang, he was forced to flee. Before leaving, he instructed his eldest disciple, Bianyan Mei, to stay by Yuan Yong's side. Now that he had reemerged, he'd have to make a trip to Zhou and pay a visit to Yuan Yong, who'd ascended to emperor after seizing his authority back from Yuan Hu. In recent years, Zhou had amassed power little by little, which none of the other countries were pleased to see. Not only that, but the three schools of thought weren't on good terms with the emperor of Zhou either. Yuan Yong prohibited Buddhism and Taoism, and had also denied the Confucians the right to set up lectures in Zhou, which prevented them from mass recruiting disciples. It was amid these circumstances that Huanyue sect courted Yuan Yong with their support, and Yuan Yong came to need Huanyue sect to maintain his rule. After meeting with Yuan Yong, Yan Wushi left northern Zhou and made a trip to Xuandu Mountain to meet Kunye, the rumored #1 martial expert of the Gokturks and the vanquisher of Shen Qiao. They fought a match that ended in Kunye's defeat. Yan Wushi's moniker, Demon Lord, resurfaced in the Jianghu, and both heaven and earth shuddered. Rumors abounded that another terrifying powerhouse had emerged from the demonic sects to fill the void left by Cui Youwang. But now that Qi Fengge was gone, one less person could stand as his equal. In Yan Wushi's opinion, while Kunye was certainly skilled and adequately talented, he was still a far cry from Hulugu's past performance. Even compared to the other famous members of the current top 10, Kunye wasn't outstanding. The fact that he'd injured Xuandu Mountain sect leader so grievously was a strange thing in itself. However, this was not his main concern. The story behind Shen Qiao's injuries, and if it was related to Kunye, Yan Wushi had no interest in learning more about either. The only reason he targeted Kunye was so that everyone would know he'd resurfaced in the Jianghu. Kunye was in the limelight after defeating Xuandu Mountain sect leader, so he was the most suitable choice. Even more importantly, Yan Wushi's greatest gain during this trip was not making a name for himself or defeating Kunye, but learning the whereabouts of one of the Zhuyang strategy scrolls. Legend held that 50 years ago, Tao Hongjing, a grandmaster of his generation, met an immortal on Mount Mao and was granted the Dengzhen instructions. That book contained 4 parts, and Tao Hongjing organized 3 of them into a manual called the Dengzhen Concealed Instructions. As for the small remaining part, Tao Hongjing fashioned it into a separate book because its contents were cryptic, relating mainly to the union of man and heaven through cultivation. To this, he added his lifetime of learnings and the key points of his understandings, and altogether they later became the renowned Zhuyang strategy. Tao Hongjing was a man of great learning. Though he was a Taoist priest by trade, he was proficient in all 3 schools of thought, and he'd also received the lifelong learnings of immortal master Sun Youyue from Danyang. Taken together, this knowledge transformed his martial arts beyond perfection. Even Qi Fengge was forced to admit defeat. Tao Hongjing was the undisputed number one in the world. Of course, considering these origins, everybody was dying to read the Juyang strategy. It was said that if one could comprehend all 5 volumes of the Juyang strategy, they'd finally be able to glimpse the zenith sought by all martial artists throughout the ages, grasp it, and break through to a new echelon beyond all others. It might even be possible to ascend to the heavens as an immortal. Unfortunately, after Tao Hongjing passed on, Mount Mao's Shangqing sect became embroiled in dynastic politics. Each disciple had their own stance and position, and as the Liang dynasty fell into civil strife, the 5 volumes of the Juyang strategy were scattered throughout the land, their whereabouts unknown. Things didn't change until decades later, when Qi Fengge himself admitted the truth about his martial arts, that beyond inheriting the legacy of Xuandu Mountain, he'd also benefited from the Juyang strategy. After that, the location of the Juyang strategy were brought to light one after another. 1 volume was said to be hidden by Zhou, one was with Tiantai sect, and another with Xuandu Mountain. But the last 2 remained a mystery. There'd been no news for decades, and all searching proved fruitless. Years ago, Yan Wushi had chanced upon the Juyang strategy volume that was hidden within Zhou Palace. His incredible progress after his seclusion, his great leap in cultivation, was partially due to that very Juyang strategy volume. Only those who experienced it personally could understand the Juyang strategy's sheer brilliance. One glimpse granted 100 insights. The Juyang strategy encapsulated Tao Hongjing's lifelong work integrating the mental cultivation techniques and martial arts of all 3 schools of thought. The parts were complementary, their union flawless. If Yan Wushi could see the remaining 4 volumes, then not only might the supreme martial arts be within his grasp, but even the stuff of legends might become possible for him. Unraveling the natural flaws, becoming one with heaven, all of it. Such was Yan Wushi's original motive for his excursion. While Xuandu Mountain was leaderless and panicked, he would steal inside and search for the Juyang strategy scroll. But he didn't expect that this quirk of fate would lead him to discover something else. During their match, he realized that although Kunye's moves traced back to the western regions, the source of his internal cultivation and true qi seemed different. In fact, they seemed almost imperceptibly to share a source with Yan Wushi's. It was this that led him to suspect that the reason Hulugu had nearly matched Qi Fengge in power, lagging barely a step behind, was almost certainly because he'd gotten help from the Juyang strategy. Kunye was one of Gokturk's new generation of martial experts. Given time, he might end up on the same level Hulugu had occupied, if merging the Western region's cultivation techniques with the Juyang strategy could create one Hulugu, then, of course, it could create a second. This greatly aroused Yan Wushi's interest. For some time after their duel, he followed Kunye doggedly, picking fights with him wherever the mood rose. Kunye couldn't defeat him and had no chance of escape. On the verge of a nervous breakdown, he finally chose to return to the Gokturks. Yan Wushi didn't plan to chase him all the way to Kaghanate. So, for the time being, he made his leisurely way back to the villa. The moment he returned, he heard his disciples say that Shen Qiao had woken and that he could get out of bed and walk. Shen Qiao was leaning on a bamboo cane when he came to see Yan Wushi. He approached step by step. his movements slow but very steady. A maid was at his side, supporting him. She whispered quietly to him, pointing out the path through the villa. Greetings, Shitsun. Once the maid indicated the correct direction, Sun Qiao bowed towards where Yan Wushi sat. Sit. Yan Wushi put down the weighty piece he'd been holding. Opposite him was Yu Shengyan, crushing misery written all over his face. Some heartfelt relief was mixed in it as well, though. He was obviously losing the game. Sun Qiao sat down with the help of the maid. After he'd woken, his memories were vague, so much so that he couldn't remember his own name or his past. And of course, he had absolutely no recollection of Yan Wushi and Yu Shengyan. How are your injuries healing? Asked Yan Wushi. Many thanks to Shitsun for his concern. This disciple can already get out of bed and walk, but his limbs are still weak, and his martial arts have yet to recover, it seems. Hand, ordered Yan Wushi. Sun Qiao held out his hand obediently, and Yan Wushi immediately pinched both his wrist and gate of life. He examined them for a moment, and a trace of surprise flitted across his impassive face. He gave Sun Qiao a meaningful glance. Because Sun Qiao couldn't see, his expression remained guileless and vacant. Yan Wushi asked, Do you feel any discomfort? Sun Qiao thought for a moment. Every night at midnight, my body grows hot and cold, and there's a dull pain in my chest. Sometimes it's so painful that I can barely walk. Yu Shengyan added, This disciple had a doctor look at it. They said that it was probably to do with Shidi's serious injuries, and his recuperation will take time. Yan Wushi sneered a little at how smooth that Shidi had been. Then he said to Sun Qiao, Your martial arts aren't completely lost. I felt a wisp of true qi within your body. It was not strong, but neither was it weak. So recovery may be possible with time. However, my Huanyue sect has no place for worthless idlers. I have an errand for your Shixiong, and you should follow along and lend him a hand. Of course, said Sun Qiao. He didn't ask what the errand was. It was exactly how he'd been with Yu Shengyan. He agreed to whatever was said. The rest of the time, he only sat there quietly, making no unnecessary movements. In his current state, Sun Qiao was a fallen tiger, but Yan Wushi felt no sympathy for his plight. The man's misfortune only ignited an even stronger malice within him. More and more, he wanted to dye that pure white completely black and ruin it. Then go back to your room first and rest, he said airily. Sun Qiao obediently rose and bowed to excuse himself, and then left slowly, with the maid's assistance. Yan Wushi pulled his gaze from Sun Qiao's back and said to Yu Shengyan, You need not rush to Banbu Peak for now. Make a trip directly to Qi and kill the Grand Master of Remonstrance Yan Zhiwen, along with his entire family. Yes, Yu Shengyan accepted without hesitation. Has that man offended Shitsun? He is a member of He Huan sect and one of He Huan sect's eyes in Qi. Yu Shengyan was only too excited to hear this. Yes, He Huan sect has strutted around for too long. While you were in seclusion, Yuan Xiuxiu repeatedly made trouble for Huanyue sect. If we don't return this favor, our Huanyue sect would look awfully soft, wouldn't we? This disciple will set out in a few days. Then he paused, his smile fading just a touch. Shitsun wants me to bring Sun Qiao along? He asked doubtfully. He's lost all his martial arts, so I fear he won't be much help at all. The shadow of a smile crept across Yan Wushi's face. Since you call him Shidi, you should at least take him to see the world. His martial arts may not have recovered, but he can still kill a person or two. Yu Shengyan understood then. His master was treating Sun Qiao like a sheet of white paper, one that he wanted to dye a solid black. Even if Shen Qiao came to his senses or recovered his memory one day, anything he'd already done would be irrevocable. At that point, it would be impossible to return to the righteous path, even if he wanted to. And what was wrong with being like them anyway? They acted without constraints, did whatever they wanted, and were free from the laws and conventions of the world. Yu Shengyan believed that it was human nature to be evil. Deep down, he thought everyone possessed a dark side. The only difference was whether that darkness had the chance to awaken. Those so called Taoist, Buddhist, and Confucian ideologies went on and on about benevolence and virtue, morality and compassion, but in the end, they were just using righteousness to paper over their own selfish desires. There was even less to be said about struggles for the throne. Might makes right and winner takes all. Was there any country whose rulers' hands weren't soaked in blood? Who could claim they were cleaner than the rest? Yes, this disciple will make sure to guide Shudi well. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of the first 3 chapters of Thousand Autumns or Qianqiu. I hope you enjoyed this reading. This is my very first time ever doing something like this. So if you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments. If there's anything you think I can improve upon, whether it be the way I read, the sound, or anything like that, you can also comment that below as well. Again, the goal is to make this just as enjoyable for everyone else as it is when I am reading it myself. So, I wish you all well, and until next time.